In northern France, in the last days of August 1944, heat and dust ruled everything. The air felt baked, the ground powder dry, every movement raising grit that clung to skin and cloth. For Eric, time was counted down in minutes. His unit of Field Photo Interpretation Detachment attached to a Luftwaffe reconnaissance wing had moved twice in the past 72 hours. Finally settling in an abandoned farmhouse that smelled of old hay and stale smoke. Now the order arrived. It was not the usual relocation, but a complete evacuation, destruction included. The wing's main body had long since gone out of contact. They, the technical tail, had to erase themselves before Allied advance elements reached this place. Inside the farmhouse's dim main room, the air stung with the reek of acid and burning paper. The precious stereoscopic viewers and film developing devices that made their work possible had already been smashed in the trucks outside, their glass and metal reduced to broken housings and bent frames. That was easier, almost satisfying, a simple violence against expensive tools. But the hardest problem remained the film itself, rolls that carried the wing's aerial reconnaissance results. By regulation, such material should be destroyed in a dedicated incinerator. The heavy furnace, however, had been abandoned in the first hurried move left behind under pursuing artillery fire. The acting commander, a captain with a bandage wrapped around his forehead, gave his instructions in a few short sentences. Not the usual move: evacuate and destroy what could not be carried. Use any means. Ensure nothing with possible value fell into enemy hands. Then, as if refusing to look back, he climbed onto the last barrel truck that could still move and disappeared west in a sheet of dust, leaving Eric and the other two men in the farmhouse with the stink of acid and the weight of time. The other two chose the most direct method. They tore film from its canisters and plunged the rolls into an iron basin filled with strong acid, or threw them into a pile of burning documents. The room filled with sharp crackles, popping bursts, and rolling smoke that clawed at the throat. Acid foamed and hissed. Paper flared and curled, ash lifting in sheets. Their movements were frantic and heedless, like men trying to outrun a fire they could hear but not yet see. Eric did not move at once. He stood by a rickety wooden table in the corner where a dark green metal case lay open, the standard storage container for 35mm aerial reconnaissance film. A label on the inside of the lid listed the date, the area number, and the mission code. This roll had been delivered only the day before by a panicked runner, part of a backlog that had not yet been interpreted. What it contained, an exposed supply point, a camouflage position, the remnants of an airfield, he did not know and no longer needed to know. His task was to make it disappear. The acid basin sat only a few steps away, yet his professional instincts resisted that kind of chaotic destruction. Film plunged into acid reacted violently, producing toxic fumes, and might not fully destroy every image. Worse, it left a signature, the unmistakable trace that technical material had been handled and hurriedly dissolved. A basin of scorched metal and etched emulsion was as clear a message as a label. His eyes moved across the room and stopped at a heap of odds and ends left by the farmhouse owner. A torn wicker suitcase, spilled old magazines, and a child's sweater. Beside it was a cookie tin printed with a faded floral pattern. Its lid sat half open. Inside were family photographs and a bundle of letters tied together. A plan formed quickly in his precisely working mind. What he needed was concealment, not a ruin that advertised itself. If this technical object could vanish among harmless civilian possessions, the risk it carried, military risk and the risk of his own identity being traced, would drop as low as it could. It fit his pursuit of order. Let what should not exist merge into the background without being noticed, absorbed by the noise of ordinary things. He picked up the metal case and tried to pry the label off with a fingernail. It held fast. From beside the burning pile, he took a multi-purpose knife. With the tip, he scraped at the paper carefully, bit by bit, then worked at the adhesive beneath. The metal surface took on ugly scratches that caught the dim light. Each scrape felt like time lost, yet he kept his hand steady, refusing haste. At last, every letter and number disappeared. Now the case looked like nothing more than an old, slightly battered container. He unscrewed the lid, confirmed the black roll inside was intact, and closed it again. He carried the cookie tin to the table and removed the photographs and letters, setting them aside. One photograph showed a smiling family in a garden, faces blurred by age and sun. The letters were written in neat French script, folded with care and tied together. His gaze paused for less than a second. These traces of unknown lives had nothing to do with his task. He placed the unlabeled metal case at the bottom of the tin, then covered it with the photographs and letters until the case was completely hidden, and to the touch only a faint bulge remained. He closed the lid and pressed it down with his palm. At that moment, engine noise and hurried footsteps sounded outside the window, mixed with shouted English. Still some distance away, but closing. The other two soldiers jerked in alarm, threw the last rolls of film into the fire, and ran out the farmhouse's rear door without looking back. Eric's heartbeat spiked, yet his hands stayed steady. Flames were licking toward the wooden table. Leaving the tin to burn here would be unreliable. Paper would char, but metal might survive, and a surviving case would invite attention. He needed movement, not fire, a more natural way for the object to vanish. He grabbed the cookie tin and strode out the front door. The dirt road outside had the confused look of a retreat turned into a migration. A small group of German soldiers trudged east with lowered heads. Among them moved terrified French civilians pushing broken handcarts piled with bedding and bundles. Farther off, gunfire and artillery rumbled indistinctly, direction uncertain. The confusion was cover. Eric pulled off his rumpled field gray jacket, tore away the shoulder boards, and revealed a dark civilian shirt beneath, prepared earlier. He balled up the uniform and shoved it into a half-full trash crate by the roadside. He walked to a separate heap of abandoned belongings, a split suitcase, scattered children's clothes, empty tins, broken bottles. He set the cookie tin on top with the same careless motion as anyone adding one more useless object. Then he stepped back and merged into the passing column of mixed soldiers and civilians, head down, shoulders tight, moving east. He did not run. Running would be a signal. He forced his pace to match the others, to become one more shape in the stream. After a few dozen meters, he looked back. Smoke began to rise from one corner of the farmhouse. The abandoned pile with the cookie tin on top lay quietly in the dust under the August sun, so unremarkable it felt almost comforting. The anxious tension of an unfinished matter eased inside him. He had removed identifying marks, chosen a banal container, and placed it where it would be swallowed by a larger chaos. He believed an Allied soldier would see photographs and letters, assume harmless private property, and move on. He was betting on hurried eyes and a system built to advance, not to linger. Hours later, American jeeps and armored reconnaissance vehicles rolled onto the road. Soldiers jumped down, tactically competent, and secured the farmhouse and surrounding area. The fire had been put out. Embers smoldered with thin blue smoke. A sergeant noticed the roadside pile and sent 2 men forward. With rifle stocks, they nudged the suitcase and clothes, then looked at the cookie tin. One casually lifted the lid, glimpsed photographs and letters, snapped it shut, and reported it as civilian property. The sergeant ordered the abandoned items gathered and stacked with other such material to await rear units tasked with sorting and disposal. The front was moving. Their job was to hold the perimeter and push forward, not to become archivists. The next day, a military truck with a canvas cover arrived. The marking showed it belonged to a theater logistical unit's captured property and document collection service. Soldiers in work trousers loaded many items, tagging each batch with the collection point and date. The batch containing the cookie tin received a number, Civilian Effects 14. The truck drove off in dust toward a transfer point about 20 miles to the rear, newly established and called Document Collection Station Number 77. The tin, the photographs, and the unmarked metal case entered the administrative system's digestive tract, where objects became labels and were passed along in accordance with printed rules. Station 77 operated out of a requisitioned rural freight warehouse. High brick walls held the stale smell of old paper, dust, damp wood, and sweat. A large French slogan painted in lime wash was partially covered by English placards and crude flow charts. Light leaked through a few grimy upper windows, turning dust into pale columns. The floor was crowded with crates, sacks, and loose objects that formed narrow winding paths. At the entrance, items arrived in an endless stream and received temporary tags. At the exit, sorted batches were repacked and loaded for different destinations: detailed review centers, translation units, or disposal. The place was a gut for information and debris, performing the first rough digestion. Clerk Sergeant Tom worked on the warehouse's east side at a long table improvised from planks laid over empty ammunition boxes. His tabletop was tidy by necessity: a stack of blank classification tags, several pencils, a rusted tin of dirty water used as a rinse cup, and a laminated procedure card wrapped in clear oilcloth, its edges worn by use. The card was printed in bold: initial classification procedure for captured documents and property. Simple boxes and arrows connected key steps: receive items, rapid visual check for obvious weapons or explosives, initial sorting by material and type, screen against suspicious indicators, tag and transfer to the next stage. The indicator list was framed in red, short enough to memorize and concrete enough to use when tired. Unlabeled metal containers or containers with labels deliberately damaged, books with unusually thick or hollowed sections, damp packages or those with chemical odors, maps, charts, code books, and other formats that tended to hide operational value. The card did not ask Tom to be clever. It asked him to be consistent. Tom wore standard field uniform with sleeves rolled to the elbows, exposing thick forearms. His movements were not fast, but they had a steady rhythm, like factory work. With each item, his eyes swept quickly and his fingers brushed the surface before he made the decision the process required. German military manuals went to paper documents translation. A broken binocular casing became metal misc evaluate. A bundle of private letters received a brief flip to confirm nothing was tucked inside, then went to civilian papers, low priority. His face carried no excitement and no disgust. He handled the stream as a practice worker handles parts, not to understand their lives, but to route them correctly. The stream of objects produced numbness like information overload, but Tom trained himself to keep baseline sensory alertness. His hands grew sensitive to weight and texture. Paper had a normal heft, a book had a certain hardness, cloth had a certain softness. Any deviation drew his attention briefly, not from curiosity, but from conditioned reflex. The first red-framed indicator, the unlabeled metal container, was as much tactile as visual. It was the kind of rule that worked even when the mind was tired. Around 2 in the afternoon, a crate labeled Civilian Effects 14 was open near his table. A woman's coat, cuffs shiny with wear, tumbled out with children's primers, a picture frame without glass, a broken-toothed comb, and the floral cookie tin. Tom shook the coat and put it into the clothing basket. He flipped the primers to confirm they were only children's books and set them with civilian paper. The frame and comb went to miscellaneous. Then he picked up the cookie tin. It was not heavy. It felt ordinary. He lifted the lid. On top lay family photographs, yellowing and stained at the corners, showing casual scenes, garden poses, outings, faces half lost to time. Beneath them were bundled letters in French, folded carefully, tied together. Tom flipped the photographs with the same quick motion he used on countless other harmless papers. Then his fingertips met hard, cool metal where paper had no business hiding it. Tom stopped. He lifted the photographs and letters out and set them on the table. At the bottom of the tin lay a dark green metal case, palm-sized, unmarked. Its surface bore fine scratches that looked new, as if someone had worked to remove a label and then tried to make the object look simply worn. It was heavier than it looked, dense and solid. He gave it a small shake. Nothing rattled. It seemed sealed. His eyes flicked to the red-framed line on the procedure card. Unlabeled metal containers. Labels deliberately damaged. The object in his hand matched the description as if it had been built to test the rule. Tom did not try to open it. That was not his role. The card did not require him to know what it was. It required him to notice that it was out of place and route it accordingly. He took a blank yellow tag and wrote in pencil, "Unlabeled metal case from Civilian Effects 14 tactile screen," then added his initials and the date. He put the metal case back into the tin, packed the tin together with the photographs and letters into a small cardboard box, and stuck the yellow tag on the outside. He raised a hand to a soldier assigned to hauling and pointed toward a canvas-curtained corner marked "Inspection Room, Authorized Personnel Only." The soldier nodded, lifted the box, and carried it down a narrow path between crates into the curtained area. Tom watched it go for a moment, then turned back to the cloth where the broken-toothed comb waited and dropped it into the miscellaneous bin. In his workflow, the anomaly had been closed, identified, tagged, transferred. The inspection room was smaller and more controlled. A sturdy table sat under a bright task lamp. A basic tool set lay ready: screwdrivers, pliers, a magnifying glass. A technical sergeant wearing a counterintelligence corps armband supervised. The operator, a corporal, opened the tagged box, glanced at the family photographs and letters, and dismissed them as background. His attention fixed on the metal case. Up close, the scrape marks were unmistakable, deliberate removal, recent and thorough. With tools, he worked the threaded lid free. It released with a faint hiss, as if it had been tightly sealed. Inside, tightly wound on a black spool, was film. The corporal recognized it at once. 35mm aerial reconnaissance film, not ordinary civilian camera stock. The counterintelligence sergeant did not need a lecture to see the implication. An unmarked military spec roll hidden among civilian possessions was enough to justify escalation. The corporal resealed the case, placed it with Tom's yellow tag into a secure transport pouch, and wrote a brief record. Unlabeled metal case containing one undeveloped 35mm film roll. Source Station 77, Civilian Effects 14, identified during initial screening. He signed, the supervising sergeant countersigned. The pouch was put into the queue for the next urgent courier run to a field photo interpretation unit. That evening, under tents and camouflage netting, the interpretation unit received the pouch. The duty officer read the record and sent it straight to the dark room. The film was handled with routine care, loaded onto reels, submerged in developer, washed, fixed, and hung to dry. An hour later, wet negatives gleamed under dim red light and then under white as they were moved to examination. Under a stereoscopic viewer, an interpreter studied frame after frame. French countryside from above, hedgerows and fields, narrow roads, tree lines, small villages. The images were sharp, then the pattern emerged. A clearing in the trees, netting draped over aircraft outlines. Tarpaulin-covered stacks blended into shadows. A hangar entrance engineered to disappear into the forest line. It was a German field airstrip camouflaged with care. The interpreter did what procedure required. He pulled the most recent Allied reconnaissance photographs and compared terrain features. He checked coordinates against maps and then against the newest ground advance reports. The picture that formed was almost anticlimactic. The airstrip's location matched an area already seized 2 days earlier by an advancing American armored detachment after only light resistance. The report mentioned destroying a small amount of enemy materiel left on the ground. The interpreter drafted an assessment. The film had historical reference value, but no immediate tactical value. The negatives and the metal case were retained as evidence. A brief summary, including the source label, Station 77, Civilian Effects 14, was filed and forwarded to counterintelligence for record. The summary did not demand an alarm. What drew counterintelligence attention was not what the film showed, but how it had appeared. A standard piece of German aerial reconnaissance equipment had been stripped of identification and embedded in a batch tagged as civilian effects. That method suggested deliberate concealment, not simple abandonment. Even if the content was obsolete, the concealment pattern might point to an unrecognized enemy practice or a weakness in Allied handling. The anomaly triggered a limited source trace, a standard subroutine. For suspicious origins, even when the content required no immediate action, follow the chain far enough to assess whether it indicated a broader risk. Lieutenant Carlson pulled Station 77's receiving logs. Civilian Effects 14 had arrived on August 27th from a collection point in an area code named Crossroads. Action records from that sector showed units clearing remaining stragglers and gathering roadside debris around a farmhouse and nearby road on August 26th and 27th. Carlson compared that timeline with capture summaries from the same area. 17 detainees were listed. Many were easily classed as infantry, wounded men, or older support personnel. Most entries were thin, name, claimed unit, or lack of one, Brief notes on condition. One entry resisted easy classification. Eric B. He claimed to be a refugee from the East, separated from family. He was stopped on the morning of August 27th, roughly 1 kilometer east of the farmhouse. The patrol note described ordinary clothing but a neat appearance, brief answers, no papers, and no luggage. He had been held as identity pending verification, one of many ambiguous bodies caught in the last churn of a collapsing front. Still, the lack of luggage and the neatness sat oddly beside the labeled refugee. It did not prove anything. It gave Carlson a fragment that did not fit cleanly. Carlson reviewed photographs and inventories from the farmhouse site. The list was unimpressive: smashed lamps, broken mounts, charred scraps. But the images showed objects consistent with a technical position rather than a random shelter. In one photograph, a partially burned work surface was visible, with document fragments not fully consumed. Enlarged, the image was blurred, yet German fragments and a recurring abbreviation tied to aerial reconnaissance support could be made out. The farmhouse looked less like a civilian dwelling interrupted and more like a temporary technical node abandoned in haste. Object, place, and time converged into a narrow question. If someone had deliberately de-identified and hidden the film case near that farmhouse, who would have had both proximity and the habit of mind to do it? Carlson did not need certainty to take the next administrative step. He issued an order transferring Eric B. from the General Holding Section to an auxiliary screening facility for background clarification tied to an anomalous captured item. The wording was cautious. Clarification, not accusation. 2 days later, Eric was escorted to another reinforced farmhouse. The room held only a table and 2 chairs, bare walls, no theatrics. That absence of menace unsettled him more than the usual threats would have. Carlson arrived with a translator and a note-taker. The opening questions were routine: claimed name, birthplace, route. Eric answered with prepared lines, sparse and careful, keeping his voice flat. Carlson listened, wrote a note or two, and then angled the conversation. Had Eric passed a farmhouse used by soldiers around the 26th? Eric said he could not remember. Many houses, much chaos. Carlson did not press. Instead, he asked, as if for classification work, how someone might hide a small metal object so it did not look military. Eric insisted he was a civilian and did not know. Carlson then slid a photograph across the table. A close view of a dark green metal case, scraped and unlabeled, scratches plain in the light. "Have you seen something like this?" Carlson asked. "No," Eric said, voice dry despite his effort. "This kind of case usually holds special film," Carlson replied, still calm. "If a person wants to erase what it is, scraping off the label is one approach." "What do you think?" "I don't know," Eric said again, eyes on the table. Carlson withdrew the photograph, closed his folder, and ended the session politely. "Thank you. We may need to verify some details. For now, stay here." Back in his holding room, Eric understood only that the case had been found and treated as suspicious. He had assumed a bulky rear area system would focus on actionable intelligence and discard the rest. Instead, it was treating the concealment method itself as a signal. He replayed the scrape marks in his mind, the careful removal that he had taken as prudence. Now that act looked like a flag. He did not know the chain that had carried the 10 from a roadside pile to an interview table. That journey was a black box, and the black box was operating against him. The unease that grew in him was not pure fear. It was logical unease, the sense of a model failing. He had built his plan on assumptions about how the enemy processed chaos, that their attention would stay on the urgent and the obvious, that mass would defeat scrutiny, that sentimental paper would discourage inspection. Yet he was now facing an apparatus that seemed interested in abnormality itself, in the way objects moved and were handled, not merely in whether their content provided immediate advantage. Carlson, in his own notes, did not need a confession on the first day. He had watched Eric's micro-reactions when the photograph appeared, a brief stiffness, a change of focus, a fraction too much control. Denial was expected. The reaction was data. Over the next days, the screening team probed with questions that sounded like idle conversation, but were technical in nature: optics, photographic scale, map symbols, the kind of topics that an ordinary civilian would answer with genuine confusion rather than cautious minimalism. Carlson also sent requests down the line to confirm whether any German records or prisoner information matched the name, age, and appearance he had been given. He did not rush. The system worked best when it moved steadily, each step producing a small piece of certainty. When the formal interview resumed, the room was the same and the tone unchanged. Carlson noted inconsistencies in Eric's account of birthplace and route, then set those aside. He said the green metal case was standard issue and its origin was clear. The film had been developed and interpreted. Eric braced for accusations about hidden intelligence, for a contest over what the images revealed and what value they still held. That was the fight he had prepared for. Deny again, force them to prove usefulness. Carlson did not offer him that fight. He stated plainly that the airstrip on the film had already been seized before the film arrived. Militarily, it was useless. The issue was why the case had been stripped of markings and hidden under family photographs in a cookie tin by the roadside. That did not match ordinary abandonment. It looked like deliberate hiding, an attempt to make a military object pass as civilian, to slide under the eyes of men trained to move fast. Carlson spoke as if thinking aloud. Perhaps a soldier had tried to keep a souvenir and feared being caught with a military item. Perhaps a technical man, in a moment of panic, had chosen concealment over destruction. If it was the second, then the person would have known the object's significance and would have understood the psychology of inspection. He would have chosen a container that looked harmless, and he would have relied on certain habits. That men do not linger over family photographs, that the appearance of private life discourages attention, that the flood of debris overwhelms careful review. Carlson laid a clean cloth on the table and placed the empty metal case on it, lid open. Under the light, the scrape marks were unmistakable, each line a record of patient effort. He tapped the bottom once with a fingertip, the sound flat and hard, and asked in the same even tone, "You put it under photographs because you thought our men would look at the pictures and never feel what was underneath. Did you really count on that?" The question struck at the premise Eric had depended on when he worked the label away and layered paper over metal. It did not argue about the airstrip or the film's value. It argued about his judgment. He had counted on the softness of private life to dull scrutiny, on hurried hands to stop at the surface, on quantity and disorder to blur a single object. For an instant he saw the chain that had defeated him, as if the links were laid out on the table. He imagined Tom's hands in the warehouse touching thousands of objects without interest, yet trained to notice a single deviation in weight and texture. He saw the red-framed line on the procedure card, a simple instruction that turned a bored clerk into a censor. He saw the inspection room lamp, the tools, the lid turning, the hiss of a seal breaking. He saw an interpreter comparing coordinates with reports, not because of inspiration, but because it was required. He saw Carlson reading logs and lists, not searching for a dramatic confession, but for mismatched fragments that could be aligned. What crushed him was the recognition that the chain did not depend on genius. It depended on repetition, on simple rules applied by ordinary people. A system did not need to understand every detail of aerial reconnaissance to catch an unlabeled film case hidden under paper. It needed only to tell one man, if you feel hard metal where paper should be, tag it. It needed to tell another, if you see fresh scrape marks, open it under supervision. It needed to tell another, if you develop film, cross-check it against the newest reports. It did not catch everything, but it caught enough. It caught him. Eric's shoulders sagged. He did not confess. But the hard shell of denial softened. He conceded that he had been exposed to Luftwaffe aviation support work, that he had at least some familiarity with the handling of aerial film and the significance of unprocessed reconnaissance material. He still insisted he could not speak to the specific case, still clung to the final refuge of ignorance. Yet his concession, combined with the proximity and the object's origin, was enough to change how he was categorized. For Carlson, it was sufficient. The inquiry was about risk and pattern, not courtroom certainty. A deliberately de-identified case hidden among civilian effects had been detected by routine screening traced to a sector where a technical point had existed and matched with a detainee whose story and reactions fit the shadow cast by that point. Carlson drafted his report with the same calm structure as the procedure card that had begun the chain. The captured film's content had no immediate tactical value. The concealment method indicated deliberate hiding. The screening procedure had functioned as intended and should remain unchanged. The system, in other words, had validated itself. Eric was returned to his room. The empty case remained on the table as evidence. For him, it became a symbol of the collapse of a belief that controlling details could control fate, that chaos and quantity could hide a single technical object. He had learned a different logic. A large system did not need to understand every detail to be effective. It needed only to embed enough simple rules and apply them without sentiment. His war, long after the gunfire had moved on, ended here, not in physical destruction, but in the overturning of the assumptions he had used to survive. Days later, the paperwork caught up with what the field had already settled. The final write-up on Civilian Effects 14 was brief and unsentimental. It recorded that an unmarked German aerial film case, discovered by routine tactile screening at Station 77, contained reconnaissance film with no immediate tactical value. It noted that the deliberate removal of markings and the choice of concealment among family photographs indicated intentional hiding. It summarized the limited source trace. Collection at the farmhouse sector during August 26th to 27th, transfer through the captured property system, and identification of a detainee with relevant technical background whose reactions supported a reasonable association. The conclusion was administrative rather than dramatic. The screening procedure had functioned as intended and should remain unchanged. The case and its documentation were filed, the metal container placed with other processed evidence on a numbered shelf, and the machine of forms and routes turned on to the next item. In the same file, Eric's status was adjusted from an uncertain civilian claim to a standard prisoner classification under closer management. No one wrote it as a personal tragedy. It read like a lesson in process, a reminder that simple filters, repeated across thousands of hands, could pull a hidden object out of the noise even when the object's content was already stale. By the time the ink dried, the front had moved again, and the warehouse still filled with new crates. At Station 77, Tom finished another day's work. He wiped his laminated procedure card clean under its oilcloth and put it away. Another stack of tags was gone. Outside, trucks hauled away today's sorted boxes and would bring more tomorrow. Tom rubbed stiffness from the back of his neck and stepped into the evening air. Sunset painted the fields gold. He did not know what the floral cookie tin had triggered or what had happened to the man behind the neat refugee story. For him, it had been one more ordinary moment of following the card, and that was enough.